Have you ever felt like someone was deeply interested in you one moment and emotionally gone the next without any clear reason? And no matter what you do, the more you try to get close, the further they seem to move away? If that sounds familiar, then what you are about to understand can change the way you see love, attachment, and emotional connection forever. Because this is not just about one person acting distant. This is about a pattern that repeats itself in relationships more often than people realize. A pattern where closeness doesn't create comfort, it creates fear, and where love doesn't always feel like safety, but sometimes feels like pressure. When you get too close to someone with avoidant tendencies, something very specific happens inside the relationship dynamic. It is not always obvious at first. In fact, it often begins in the most beautiful way. There is attention, there is interest, there is emotional warmth. It feels real, it feels rare. And that is exactly what makes the later shift so confusing, because human psychology is deeply wired for connection. When someone shows us care, our brain releases emotional signals that create attachment. We don't just like the person, we start investing in them emotionally. We start imagining consistency. We start expecting stability. And when that expectation is built, even slightly, we begin to feel safe. But here is where the contradiction begins. For some people, closeness does not register as safety, it registers as pressure. This is where avoidant attachment patterns come in, not as a label to judge someone, but as a psychological defense system shaped by experience. For an avoidant individual, emotional closeness can unconsciously trigger discomfort, not because they do not feel, but because feeling too much, too close, or too dependent on someone else can feel overwhelming. So instead of leaning into intimacy, they instinctively create distance. And this distance is not always loud. It is often subtle. A slower reply, a slightly colder tone, less emotional expression, more silence where there used to be openness. Nothing dramatic enough to clearly define as rejection, but enough to make the other person feel uncertain. And uncertainty is where emotional attachment becomes powerful and painful at the same time, because the human mind does not handle uncertainty well. It tries to solve it. It tries to predict it. It tries to regain control over it. So when someone becomes inconsistent, the brain starts working harder. You begin replaying conversations. You begin analyzing tone, timing, and behavior. You start asking yourself questions like, did I do something wrong? Or was everything real, or was I imagining it? And without realizing it, emotional energy shifts. Instead of being present in the connection, you become focused on fixing the confusion. This is where the first real emotional shift happens in relationships with avoidant dynamics. Not the distance itself, but the internal reaction it creates. Because once the mind enters that loop of uncertainty, attachment deepens in a very specific way. Not through stability, but through emotional chasing. And the more you chase clarity, the more the dynamic intensifies. But what makes this even more complex is that avoidant individuals often do not consciously intend to hurt or confuse anyone. From their perspective, they are trying to regulate their own emotional state. When things feel too close, too fast, or too emotionally intense, stepping back feels like relief. It feels like control. It feels like breathing again. So what looks like emotional withdrawal from one side feels like emotional self-protection from the other. And this creates a silent emotional mismatch. One person starts leaning in for reassurance. The other starts stepping back for space. And without either fully realizing it, a push and pull cycle begins to form. This is the point where most people get emotionally stuck, because they are trying to apply logic to something that is driven by emotional regulation patterns rather than simple intention. You assume closeness should naturally bring two people together, but in this dynamic, closeness triggers opposite reactions, and this is where the hurt begins. Not because love is absent, but because love is being experienced in two completely different emotional languages. One person associates closeness with security, the other associates closeness with pressure. And when two nervous systems are operating from opposite emotional interpretations, even good intentions can feel like rejection. This is why understanding this pattern is so important, because without awareness, you will naturally start personalizing the behavior. You will think it is about your value, your worth, your actions, your mistakes. But in reality, it is often about emotional conditioning that existed long before you entered the picture. And here is something most people never realize until it is too late. The pain does not come from the distance itself. It comes from the inconsistency between closeness and withdrawal. The unpredictable emotional rhythm creates a loop in the mind that becomes difficult to break. And once you are inside that loop, it feels like you are constantly trying to get back to the version of the connection that existed in the beginning, but that version becomes harder to reach, and this is where emotional confusion turns into emotional exhaustion. Now, before going deeper into what avoidant behavior actually looks like step by step and why it affects you on such a deep psychological level, it is important to stay with this understanding for a moment, because once you truly see the pattern clearly, you will stop interpreting it as something random or personal. And you will start seeing it for what it actually is, a cycle between emotional closeness and emotional self-protection. When that initial emotional warmth begins to fade, something subtle but powerful starts happening inside the connection. It does not arrive like a clear ending. It arrives like confusion. One moment there is openness, ease, and emotional availability. The next moment there is distance that cannot be explained in a direct way. No clear conflict, no obvious reason, just a shift that feels emotional but remains unspoken. This is where many people begin searching for meaning in every small detail. A delayed reply suddenly feels heavier than it should. A short response starts feeling like rejection. Even silence becomes loud in the mind. The nervous system reacts before logic has time to respond. Because the human brain is designed to detect changes in emotional patterns, especially in relationships that matter. In this stage, the avoidant response becomes more noticeable. It is not always expressed through words. It is often expressed through behavior, less initiation, reduced emotional expression, a sense of withdrawal that is difficult to define but easy to feel. The connection still exists, but the emotional accessibility starts to shift. What makes this experience so intense is not the absence of connection, but the inconsistency of it. There are moments where things feel normal again, a message that feels warm, a brief return of closeness, a short period where everything feels stable, and then, without warning, the distance returns. This alternating rhythm creates emotional instability in the other person. The mind begins to associate closeness with hope and distance with loss. Over time, this creates a cycle where emotional highs feel extremely powerful and emotional lows feel extremely painful. At this point, attachment does not remain passive, it becomes reactive. Instead of simply experiencing the connection, the mind starts trying to manage it. There is an internal effort to bring things back to how they were before. More attention is given to timing, tone, and patterns of behavior. Every small change is analyzed for meaning. But the reality is that avoidant behavior is not structured around clear intention. It is often automatic. When emotional intensity increases, the instinct is to create space. This space is not always a decision. It is a response, a way of restoring internal balance when closeness feels overwhelming. From the outside, this can feel like unpredictability. From the inside, it can feel like regulation. Two different internal experiences happening at the same time, creating a disconnect that neither side fully explains. As this pattern continues, emotional confusion slowly builds. The mind starts trying to find consistency where there is none. It looks for reassurance in patterns that keep changing. And this search becomes exhausting because it is based on something that is not stable. In many cases, the person on the receiving end begins adjusting their own behavior. Less expression, more caution, careful communication, attempts to avoid triggering distance. Without realizing it, emotional energy shifts from being natural to being managed. Instead of feeling free in the connection, there is constant self-monitoring. This is where emotional tension increases quietly, not through conflict, but through adaptation. One side creates space automatically, the other side starts filling that space with effort, and this imbalance grows over time. What is often misunderstood is that avoidant patterns are not necessarily about lack of feeling. They are about discomfort with emotional intensity. When closeness reaches a certain level, it can activate internal resistance. Not because the connection is unwanted, but because it feels emotionally consuming. So distance becomes a form of relief. It creates room to breathe. It allows emotional reset. But this relief is temporary, because once the distance grows, connection is still present internally, and that creates its own form of tension. This is why the pattern repeats: approach, withdrawal, return, distance again. It is not a linear process, it is cyclical, and each cycle strengthens emotional confusion in the other person. Over time, this dynamic begins to affect perception. Moments of closeness feel more valuable because they are inconsistent. The mind starts holding onto them more tightly. Meanwhile, moments of distance feel more painful because they disrupt emotional expectation. This imbalance slowly changes how attachment is experienced. What makes this stage particularly difficult is that both sides may still care in their own way. But care alone is not enough to create stability when emotional regulation styles are different. One side regulates through closeness, the other regulates through distance. And neither approach naturally aligns. This creates a silent emotional tension where both people are reacting to each other without fully understanding the internal reason behind the reactions. One experiences anxiety from uncertainty, the other experiences relief from space. And both responses feed into the cycle. As this continues, the connection starts feeling heavier, not because it lacks meaning, but because it lacks emotional consistency. The mind begins to feel tired from trying to interpret something that keeps changing shape. And in this exhaustion, awareness begins to form, a quiet realization that effort alone is not stabilizing the connection. That understanding alone is not creating emotional safety. That the more the pattern repeats, the more it reinforces itself. This is where the experience becomes emotionally deeper, because it is no longer just about behavior. It becomes about internal response, about how the nervous system reacts to inconsistency, about how attachment forms under uncertainty, and about how emotional patterns shape perception without conscious awareness. And as this understanding becomes clearer, the next layer reveals something even more important about why this dynamic affects emotional well-being so strongly, and why it is so difficult to break once it becomes established. At a certain point in this dynamic, something deeper begins to form beneath the surface of behavior. It is no longer just about messages, timing, or distance. It becomes about emotional interpretation. The mind starts building meaning around inconsistency, and that meaning begins to influence how the entire connection is experienced internally. When someone becomes unpredictable in their emotional availability, the human brain does something very specific. It starts trying to create patterns out of randomness. This is not a conscious choice, it is a survival mechanism. The mind prefers uncertainty with explanation over uncertainty without explanation. So it begins to assign reasons, even when there are no clear ones. This is where emotional attachment becomes stronger in a very unusual way. Not through stability, but through mental engagement. The more unclear the situation becomes, the more attention it receives internally. Thoughts begin to circle around possible explanations. Small interactions gain significance far beyond their actual weight. A short message is no longer just a message, it becomes a signal. A pause becomes a question. A return becomes a relief that feels larger than it should. At the same time, emotional regulation inside the avoidant pattern continues operating differently. When closeness increases, there is an internal shift toward withdrawal, not necessarily because of rejection, but because emotional intensity starts to feel unmanageable. Space creates a sense of control again. It allows internal balance to return. But this creates a structural imbalance in the connection. One side begins to invest more emotional energy when uncertainty rises. The other side begins to reduce emotional exposure when intensity rises. So instead of moving toward each other at the same time, both responses move in opposite directions depending on emotional pressure. Over time, this creates a psychological loop. The mind of the more attached person starts associating emotional relief with moments of reconnection. When contact returns, there is a temporary sense of stability. When distance returns, there is emotional discomfort. This contrast slowly strengthens the importance of the reconnection moments. This process is not intentional. It develops through repetition. The brain learns patterns through emotional reinforcement. When relief follows reconnection, even briefly, the connection becomes more significant in memory. When discomfort follows distance, the absence becomes more emotionally charged. This is why the experience can feel intense even without major events happening. The intensity is not always in actions. It is in the emotional contrast between states. Stability would normally reduce emotional urgency, but inconsistency increases it. Meanwhile, the avoidant response is also shaped by internal learning. When emotional closeness feels overwhelming, stepping back becomes a form of regulation. It is not always about avoiding the person, it is about reducing internal pressure. Distance creates a sense of calm. It reduces emotional saturation and restores a feeling of independence. However, this relief is temporary because emotional connection does not disappear internally. It continues to exist in the background. So even when distance is created for comfort, the connection is not fully resolved. It remains present but contained. This creates a secondary layer of tension that is often not visible. One side feels activated by inconsistency. The other side feels pressured by intensity. Both are reacting to the same connection, but through different emotional systems. As this continues, the mind of the more emotionally invested person begins to adapt. Behavior changes gradually. Communication becomes more careful. Expression becomes more measured. There is a growing awareness of what might create distance and what might bring closeness. This leads to a form of emotional self-monitoring that slowly replaces natural expression. Instead of simply being in the connection, energy is spent managing the connection. Thoughts begin to shift toward prediction, trying to anticipate reactions, trying to avoid withdrawal, trying to recreate moments of closeness through controlled interaction. But the core issue remains unchanged. Because the pattern is not being created by communication alone, it is being driven by internal emotional regulation differences. One system seeks closeness for reassurance. The other seeks distance for balance. This difference creates emotional instability even in calm moments, because calm is not consistent. It is temporary. The mind remains alert to change. Even in neutral periods, there is an underlying expectation that something will shift again. This expectation alone keeps emotional sensitivity high. The nervous system stays engaged, not relaxed, waiting for the next change in pattern. This state can feel mentally draining over time, even if nothing dramatic is happening externally. What makes this experience particularly complex is that both sides can still care deeply. But care does not automatically translate into emotional compatibility. When two emotional regulation systems operate differently, care exists, but synchronization does not. This is why understanding the internal mechanics of this pattern becomes important. Without awareness, the experience is interpreted personally, as rejection, as inadequacy, as lack of value. But internally, the behavior is often rooted in emotional processing rather than evaluation of worth. As awareness grows, perception begins to shift. The focus moves from asking why someone behaves a certain way to understanding what the pattern is doing to emotional stability. This shift is subtle but powerful. It reduces personalization. It introduces clarity where confusion used to dominate. And in that clarity, a new realization begins to form. That emotional intensity does not always equal emotional safety. That inconsistency is not a foundation for stability. And that understanding behavior does not always mean continuing to stay inside it. This is where the experience starts moving toward deeper awareness of self-response. Not control over the other person, but recognition of internal impact. And from here, the next layer becomes even more focused on how emotional patterns shape attachment decisions, often without conscious awareness. At this stage, something shifts quietly but powerfully inside the emotional experience. It is no longer just about trying to understand behavior or decode patterns. It becomes about what this pattern is doing to inner stability over time. The focus slowly moves away from the other person and starts turning inward, toward emotional response and mental exhaustion. One of the most overlooked effects of this kind of dynamic is how deeply it engages the mind without providing resolution. The brain is built to seek closure. When situations feel unfinished, attention remains active. It keeps returning to unresolved emotional material, trying to complete the picture. But when the situation keeps changing shape, closure never fully arrives. This creates a loop of mental activity that feels like thinking, but is actually emotional processing without conclusion. Thoughts return again and again to the same points. What was said, what was not said, what changed, what felt different. Each moment is analyzed, not for curiosity, but for stability. The mind is trying to find something solid to hold onto. As this continues, emotional sensitivity increases. Small variations in communication begin to feel amplified. A slight delay carries more weight than it should. A brief response feels colder than intended. Even neutral behavior can be interpreted through a lens of emotional uncertainty. This is not because perception is wrong, but because the nervous system has adapted to inconsistency. When emotional unpredictability becomes familiar, the body starts preparing for change even during calm moments. This creates a state of quiet alertness, not panic, but readiness, a sense that stability might not last long. Over time, this affects how relaxation is experienced. Even peaceful moments can feel temporary, as if they are waiting to shift again. On the other side, emotional distancing continues to operate through internal regulation. When intensity builds, stepping back feels necessary for balance. It creates mental space. It reduces emotional overload. It restores a sense of internal order that closeness sometimes disrupts. But this regulation style does not eliminate emotional connection. It only reduces exposure to it in the moment, so the emotional thread remains, even when distance is present. This creates a strange duality. Connection exists internally, while separation exists externally. The two states do not fully align. This mismatch is where confusion deepens for the other person, because from their perspective, connection should naturally lead to consistency. When that expectation is not met, interpretation begins to fill the gap. The mind starts building explanations for behavior that feels emotionally inconsistent. At this point, attachment begins to shift from experience-based to interpretation-based. Instead of reacting to what is happening, the mind reacts to what it believes is happening. This is where emotional distortion can slowly develop, not because reality is misread completely, but because incomplete information forces the brain to fill missing parts. As this process continues, emotional energy becomes increasingly invested in understanding rather than experiencing. Instead of being present in the connection, attention is directed toward decoding it. This creates distance from personal emotional needs because focus is placed outward on pattern recognition. Over time, this can lead to emotional fatigue, not sudden exhaustion, but gradual depletion. The constant need to analyze, adjust, and interpret creates mental strain. Even when nothing is actively happening, the mind remains engaged with the possibility of change. One of the most difficult aspects of this experience is that it often develops slowly. There is no clear moment where everything changes. It is a gradual accumulation of small emotional adjustments. Each one seems manageable on its own, but together they create a significant internal shift. Trust in emotional consistency becomes weaker, not necessarily trust in the person, but trust in the pattern itself. The expectation of stability becomes less certain, and when expectation weakens, emotional security begins to feel less anchored. Meanwhile, the avoidant pattern continues functioning through cycles of approach and withdrawal. Closeness activates internal intensity. Distance restores internal space. This cycle repeats not as a conscious strategy, but as a learned emotional regulation response. It is automatic, not planned. The challenge arises because both systems are internally logical, but externally misaligned. One system builds connection through continuity. The other maintains balance through distance. Neither is inherently wrong, but together they create emotional inconsistency. As awareness of this pattern deepens, perception begins to change again. Instead of viewing behavior as random or personal, it becomes easier to see it as a structured response pattern. This does not reduce emotional impact, but it does change interpretation. Confusion begins to shift toward clarity. Clarity introduces a different kind of emotional experience. It reduces guessing. It reduces internal noise. It allows space for observation rather than reaction. And in that space, emotional energy starts to return to self-awareness rather than external monitoring. This is where a critical realization begins to form. That emotional intensity without consistency does not build long-term stability. That repeated uncertainty changes how attachment is experienced, and that mental effort alone cannot resolve a pattern that is driven by emotional regulation differences. As this understanding grows, attention begins to move away from trying to fix or interpret the dynamic and toward recognizing its impact on inner state. This shift is subtle but significant because it marks the beginning of emotional separation from confusion. And from this point, the experience moves toward a deeper awareness of what it means to remain in patterns that constantly require adjustment, and how emotional balance is influenced not just by connection, but by consistency over time.